Hi, Liz.
Hello, how are you, Mary?
Oh, pretty good.
Yeah. I'm missing everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking
Usually I'm
forward.
there, but have a funky back today, so
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
it just kind of comes and goes. And today was its coming, so
Oh,
feel better just sitting at home than walking up and down the stairs there and standing up and sitting down.
well, and getting in and out of the car, that's a big
That's
one.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, hang in there. I bet you know what to do to take care of yourself, huh?
Yeah, it goes eventually.
Kind of seems like that sort of thing comes with the territory
Yeah,
these days.
it seems like it. Yeah. Yeah. Good to see you.
Mhm. Mhm. Let's see. I'm probably going to take myself off the picture because I'm going to eat a little breakfast while we're meeting. I just found this picture of a jack in a pulpit. Isn't that beautiful?
Oh, that is.
Yeah, from our garden.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice. Nice to think about the garden.
Mhm. Yeah, it's gonna happen, you know.
I guess.
Before we'll have a little more snow first, I think.
Probably.
Oh, that must be Jack.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, very good. This is for the Holy Trinity, correct?
Mm-hmm. The
All
adult
right.
form. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just want to make sure I've got the right code. These days, you never know what might come up.
Yeah.
How many people have been attending these?
The one in-person ones when I'm there between 10 to 20, and then online between 5 to 10 to 15, maybe. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think it's about, I can only speak to the latter. And yeah, 5, 10, 15, 20 sometimes.
Very good. Very good.
I don't think I've met you, Nicholas, before. Is it Nicholas?
Either Nicholas or Nick. Yeah.
Nick? Okay, I don't
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I've met you before. I'm Liz Blood.
Liz and
Mhm.
Mary. Right. Now, good. Yeah. Good to meet you. I think I kind of know the area where you guys are down in Longfellow, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I've done some work in the past at Mount Olive, not Mount Olivet, but Mount Olive, and then Christ Lutheran in
Mhm.
Minneapolis.
Yeah,
Christ.
it's both close to us. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I've done some icon work there. And I knew the pastor at Mount Olive. Well, I think he was transferred to New York and he might be back in town now, but it's been a few years.
Can you hear me online?
No.
I can barely, I can hear you, but not much. Yeah. So are you both? Oh, there we go. Oh, I can't hear that. Can't hear you very well. So this is a hybrid meeting, right?
Yes.
Hybrid.
Okay, gotcha. I see.
Pastor Ingrid is trying to get her voice.
How's this now?
Really?
Not
We turned volume up online. Can you hear me?
Barely.
barely.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, we just have to be closer to this. All right, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Nice to have you here.
Mm.
I'll move this up so people online, thumbs up if you can hear me. Liz Blood, thumbs up if you can hear me.
Okay, just say something else.
Liz Blood, can you?
Okay, I gotcha. It's just a little low, little quiet. I'll put my phone sound up. There we go.
Welcome, everybody. Nice to have you here. Third session in our Sacred Arts. And for those of you who weren't able to be with us for the first 2 weeks, those sessions are available online on the Holy Trinity Vimeo page. So you're welcome to go back to those and listen in. We talked with John Sand, who is our next door neighbor, stained glass artist, and just, you know, a neighborhood friend who is now retiring and selling his building, their building. And then the second week we had Dr. Jennifer Oz Freeman from United. And we are so grateful for both of their presentations and hope that you will be able to engage with those as you are able. Today, we have the great fortune of having Nicholas Markell with us, and he is joining us via Zoom. It's one of the great joys of the hybrid time that we get to bring in people wherever they are. You have all seen his bio in the church and in the bulletin. One of his big claims to fame is his work with the ELW, the book that's sitting on each of your chairs. If you're here with us in person, if you're at home and you have a copy of it, then you should go and get it if that's an option for you. If not, don't worry about it. I'm sure Nicholas will be able to lead you through conversation just fine without that. So today we are doing this as a question and answer session. We got some questions from some of you during the first and second sessions of this series. start with those questions. And then as you have questions that come to your mind during this session, I want you to use the paper that hopefully Randy has given out and pens that Randy has given out, and simply just walk them up and put them in this little basket, the little orange basket, and we'll get to as many questions as we can today. Nicholas has been very gracious to say that he'll take on as many questions as we can get to. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas. Welcome, Trinity. And if you have any additional words that you'd like to use to introduce yourself.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. Yeah, if you can along the way, just let me know. This is wonderful. So my name is Nick Markell. I am a primarily liturgical artist. I function out of Stillwater. I've been doing this work, I think the studio celebrates 24 years this year. So I've been doing this quite a while. A little bit, I have a background, I was in the seminary for 6 years. And so I have several graduate degrees, and then also I have a background in art. And so really what I'm doing now is a combination of my theological training and my artistic training. And I've had a liturgical art studio for quite a while now. I was given the questions by Ingrid, and so what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the main points of some of the questions that were given, and then I'm going to save the ELW, Evangelical Lutheran Worship, for the end and talk about specific images in there. And then again, if you have any questions as we go through, write them down. I also did look at the Zoom meeting that was given by John and Jennifer. So I'm aware of those. I won't talk about those specifically unless you have some questions about that. But my hope is that I can kind of springboard from what they said into a conversation that helps you maybe narrow things down a little bit in terms of what you're looking at. So what I would like to do then is start with a large kind of category of art in general, right? And underneath art, as a subcategory, I would put religious art, sacred art, maybe spiritual art. In fact, I think some of the slides that you were shown last week probably fall into that category of a religious, sacred, or spiritual theme. And then under that category is another subcategory, would be what I'd call ecclesial art. That would be art for the church. The word ecclesial comes from or means church, church related. And then another subcategory under that would be liturgical art. And liturgical art is art that corresponds to the worship of the church. And that's really my area of focus. That's certainly the area of focus for Evangelical Lutheran Worship. And what I want to focus on today, because I think when you're talking about liturgical art, I function under a variety of different principles and ideas that I may not apply in some other realm because of the unique needs or focus of what the liturgy requires or the worship of the church requires. And so I wanted to kind of start with that framework because I think it gives us an idea maybe of what you're looking at and the types of art that you're reviewing and whether or not you want to make adjustments and where you want to go into the future. One of the topics of the questions that was asked was about dynamics and trends that are going on in the church. And what I'd say is I work primarily with liturgical churches, surprise, surprise, churches that function within the liturgical tradition. What do I mean by that? Those churches, ecclesial communities that use the seasonal life of the church, right? This 4 seasons, the Advent, Lent, Easter, regular time. They tend to be churches that are ritualistic, right? They function under a certain ritual, which the Lutheran tradition does. As juxtaposed to the more evangelical, not that you can't be both, but the more evangelical contemporary churches that may be more free-flowing with their worship. They may pick a passage of scripture on a given Sunday, and that's what they preach on. Liturgical churches tend to be more structured, more ritualistic. They also have a book, they have a common lectionary. That is, there's the Bible set into certain readings at certain liturgical times during the year, and that's called the lectionary, and that is a function of many of the liturgical churches as well. So I make that point because most of my work, almost exclusively, is within that realm of the liturgy. And so some of the trends going on there, I think the trend question is an interesting one because trends are different from different traditions, right? I was listening to a talk recently about, it was a forum that was given about, I think this was back in 2017, about commemorating the Reformation. And they were talking about, they had on the panel different people from different traditions, and there was Lutheran tradition represented, the Reformed tradition, and then the Catholic tradition. And the comment was made by one that the Catholic tradition, for example, where I'm from primarily, thinks of things in kind of 50 to 100-year spans. And one of the other commenters said that many of the Protestant churches think in terms of 3 to 5 year spans. And I thought it was a very interesting insight. I don't know how accurate that is, but the point simply being that trends, or what is kind of being thought about and where you go, might be different depending how length of time, depending on what perspective you're coming from. Certainly there's been certain trends in worship in the last, say, 50 to 60 years. I think there's been an ecumenical focus. There's been a focus on the 4 elements of liturgy, which is we gather, we listen to the word, we commune, and we go forth. So liturgical churches tend to function under that structure, right? You come on a Sunday, you have some kind of gathering rite or some kind of gathering. Maybe it's an introductory song. Maybe it's a gathering place that you meet ahead of time. We listen to God's word proclaimed, fertilizing our hearts and our minds. We receive the Eucharist. We receive communion, so that word moves into action. And then we go forth and we proclaim that word to the world, or we become Christ for the world, however various traditions articulate that. And so I would say within those trends, there's a few things going on. One, I think, is a focus, particularly the more recent ones, would be some churches are going back to much more traditional models, traditional forms of art within the church. I find this in the Catholic tradition quite heavily now, because many believe that after the council closed, I don't know how familiar many of you are, but the Vatican Council was held in the late 60s. It's been going on now for 60 years. And there were a lot of innovations going on. Many now believe that there might have been a bit of a break in continuity from the past. And so there's kind of an interest to try to recover some of those things that might have been left behind in that renewal or revival kind of time. I will speak more to the idea of trends when I get to the ELW for the Lutheran tradition, because I think that the ELW represents quite well certain trends that were going on. I'll mention them briefly here, but then again later. One in the area of worship, and ELW is 15 years old now, was a more frequent reception of communion within the Lutheran Church. The second was adult baptism. And I will talk a little bit more about those two things going on in ELW and what the focus was. And again, if you have any questions on some of these, let me know. The other would be a sense of trying to more fully participate in the liturgy. That I think is a common element among liturgical churches. The Lutheran tradition has a very strong emphasis on word and music. And I've given many presentations and projects, say, with Augsburg Fortress over the years. And whereas, say, other traditions, say, particularly Eastern churches, would have a much more emphasis on the image, the icon in the life of the church. And so there's even some kind of movement within the liturgical that I'm aware of. I have a focused kind of field, but I'm aware within the Lutheran tradition, much more interest, say, in the imagery in the life of the church. And I will agree with Jennifer when she said, it's not like theology and art, but that the theology is art. And I would even put a phrase on, I would say theology as art. AS, that there are many ways to do theology in the life of the church, A predominant one has been what I'd call philosophical theology, which is to use the language of philosophy to express one's faith. If theology is our reflection on faith, faith would be what we believe, say the creeds of the church, and then theology is a reflection on those beliefs. And then there's many ways to do theology. And what I think art as is primarily aesthetic theology, which would be theology that focuses on the way in which we can understand and experience what we believe through image and through beauty, as juxtaposition to other forms or other mechanisms or tools or instruments through which we can do theology. The primary one in the Western tradition, particularly, obviously has been the written word and writing books and spoken. And so I think there is a certain recovery within some of the liturgical churches of a more focus on the image. And I think this is very important because if you look at the larger tradition, the Reformation would go back 500 years, but if you go back to the 1500 years before that, you tended in the art of the church, you tended to have an integration of the art with the architecture more, and you had a greater focus on the image as a primary kind of place of communicating faith. And so that's something maybe to ponder and also to reflect upon when you think of where your church is, how it was built, what was chosen. Again, I can answer some of those questions if you have them. I think some other trends would be, and again, related to ELW, I'll talk about later, would be inclusivity. There's a greater kind of awareness today of inclusivity within worship. Again, within the ELW, frequent communion and adult baptism. I would also say some other dynamics or trends that I have experienced or seen in various ways would be a personal faith in juxtaposition to communal faith. And where is a particular assembly or a congregation, where do they sit regarding that dynamic? I think certainly COVID has affected us. Again, this is more maybe the 3 to 5 year kind of looking at trends. I think that has affected us. What we're doing today is an effect of COVID. We're participating at least in part with Zoom. So the work I do, I also do graphics. Obviously, ELW is in the area of graphics for publication. I think that's going to be more trendy in the future. One commentator had meant maybe the focus might be connecting more than gathering for some churches, or at least as a possible dynamic. And what does that mean regarding the arts? You find this in the secular world, where companies are going from the storefront model or the brick and mortar model to online. And so I think that dynamic is one of what's the importance of connecting and gathering, and how does that relate to art? So actually, my studio is in the process of looking at doing a lot more work in the area of graphics in order to supply churches with online images of depth and insight and so forth, so that if they decide to do worship online more often or gathering, connecting, they'll have more images to do that with, images that have hopefully some depth and some spiritual integrity. One of the other topics was longevity. This is an interesting one, I think, in terms of relating past and tradition. And I'll also speak, I think, about the tradition and contemporary today a little bit. I would put art that I do into 3 kind of categories. One is temporary art. So that might be art that goes in a bulletin, art that goes on a website, art that may be a piece that a parishioner has done, which is processed in on a Sunday. Maybe it's placed before the table or placed before the pulpit. It's there to interpret maybe the particular message of that Sunday. That would be what I put in the category of temporary, things that are interchangeable. I think the hymnal, ELW, for example, would fall kind of into the category of what I would say is semi-permanent. That would be art, imagery, song that would maybe be something you can rely on for 10, 15, 30 years, depending again on how you see the tradition and how fast things are moving and so forth. There are images within the probably images within the ELW that maybe in 30 years, people would look at and say, well, we would maybe do something a little different now than what we would have done before for various reasons. Although I'll talk about our attempt to meet the needs at the time 15 years ago and what that meant when we get there. And then the last category would be permanent, that the art in the church that's permanent, and that might be stained glass. That would be maybe a mural, a large mural piece on a wall, maybe behind the altar table. Maybe it's a sculptural piece that a lot of money was spent on or whatever it might be. And so that's something I think important to consider. I don't know all the dynamics of what you're looking at and what you're hoping to do and so forth. But I think if you put your goals or your efforts into those general categories, my hope would be that at least it gives you a structure by which you may discern what can be done, what ought to be done, what would be good to do, that sort of thing. So that's what I would say in terms of longevity for now. So my questions would be related to that. So what changes have you seen in the last maybe 5, 10 years within the worship within your own assembly? Has there been some dynamics that you have seen yourself? Because art for a church, my view would be, and how I function, the liturgical art in the church should support the worship, okay? Especially if the focus of the building is primarily for the ritual life of the church. Now, there are other purposes and other things that a church architecture and art can do. It can also represent the church at large, a symbol of the church, the mystery of the church, of the reality of the church. But it's one of the main trends in the last 50 years has been to build churches that are almost primarily focused on the ritual of the church, the worship of the church. So it's built with a gathering place. It's built with a sanctuary where ritual is more easily configured, right? Where everyone can see from where they're sitting what's going on. And so architecture has been affected by that dynamic a lot, is the church is built around ritual. So that's what I would ask you is what changes have happened in your own tradition and how might that affect the art that should support that? My view would be that sacred art or liturgical art in the life of the church is there to support the liturgy itself. It's there to help us enter more deeply into the liturgy, not be some side kind of commentary or message or of other kind of nature. And so that would be, I think, a big question to ask yourselves in terms of liturgical art. Again, not art that you may purchase for other kinds of purposes, placing in different kind of areas. Maybe there's a gallery, maybe there's a place before people come into the nave of the church, but art for worship itself. And are these changes universal within your synod, or are they just your parish alone, your church life alone, your assembly alone? So I think those are really important questions to ask when you're deciding about what kind of art you may want. So what is the bigger question of what's in the Lutheran tradition? What does your tradition say about in terms of longevity? What does the tradition say about the arts and what would be appropriate? What is common to all of the ELC churches? What is particular to yours? What is unique about Holy Trinity? And then I think another dynamic that has come up in my work, because I do work for all the mainline churches. I do work for the Eastern Orthodox Church and so forth. And that would be if there's any living iconic tradition to tap into within the life of the church. Again, I think in many of the Western traditions, the image has not really played as significant a role, at least in terms of being a set kind of iconic tradition. And that would be something to think about. One of the other questions related to culture, and this is what I would say as kind of a backdrop. Christianity is the way in which a given culture lives out the gospel. So you're always going to have, I think, within Christianity, something very specific to a culture. Because a given people at a given time, they hear the gospel, They live out the commands that Jesus gave. They live out the instructions of the apostles, whatever it might be. And when you incorporate that within a given culture, you take on a certain cultural dynamic. All right. I think, again, in my work, one of the big clear distinctions is West and East, the classic kind of distinction. If you go into a mainline Protestant church, a mainline Catholic church from the Western tradition, they will have a lot of similarities. You go into an Eastern church, it's quite different. And it's quite, I think, distinct there that the culture really has affected in many ways how the gospel is lived out. But I would also say, if Christianity is the way in which a given people and a given culture live out the gospel always can transcend Christianity. It can also be the point of reference to challenging our cultural dynamics, both pro and con, both adapting what is good in the culture, but also challenging the culture as well. The church historically tends to function both ways. There are ways in which, and times in which, the church supports the culture and holds it up. And then there are times in which it challenges the culture. So from a cultural perspective, I think that's very important. One of the references I would make is to the scriptures themselves, that the scriptures, on the one hand, they are the word of God. And I say this because I come from a perspective that the image is the icon in the life of the church. It's the visual dynamic of the scriptures. In other words, there's a line used, which is, it's the visible word. So there's a theology and lived experience in the life of the church that says the image can communicate through image form, line, shape, line, color, texture, what the word proclaims in word, paragraph, sentence, so forth. All right. So if you look at the Bible as a reference, the Bible, which would be in the life of the church liturgically, the readings that we have in the lectionary on a given Sunday, they're both universal and transcendent, but also very specific, right? You have a specific people with a specific ethnicity who are relating to God. I say kind of tongue in cheek that as an iconographer, I'm bound to that. I can maybe do an icon of the Good Samaritan, but I can't do one of the Good Hittite. I'm bound by the ethnicity or the culture or the very specificity of the scriptures. So that's a really challenge for a lot of churches when it comes to art. And yet I would say that if you think about creating art on the same kind of level what the scriptures can do, they can transcend the specific, but they're also kind of immersed in the specific. And the goal always, I think, of the preacher is to interpret the scriptures, the text for today. And so I would put that out there as kind of a paradigm or a structure to relate to. If the Bible then represents for us this paradigm that we can use for the visual arts as well, and that is, it's very possible for something to be timeless and universal, but also very specific at the same time. We just simply need to break it open or interpret it for an audience today if there's some kind of lack of ability to understand the context of the cultural dynamic at the time. Again, the gospel transcends culture. What I would say regarding culture would be the primary kind of focus of imagery in the churches historically have been biblical imagery. That would be the primary focus for permanent kinds of imagery going on. And just as something to ponder and pray about, whatever you're doing, I have found, and I just lay this out as something to ponder, that authentic liturgical imagery tends to be imagery of a kingdom not of this world. And there's a certain paradoxical dimension to authentic liturgical imagery. What do I say by paradoxical? The first shall be last. In my weakness, I'm strong. The seed must die to live. Foolishness is wisdom. I must lose my life to find it. One pastor I noted had said that orthodoxy, in this sense, correctness, small o, orthodoxy is paradox. Orthodox is paradox. His point simply was that any renewal that goes on in the life of the church, if we rely upon this idea that it's imagery that is not of this world, a kingdom not of this world, and it's paradoxical to the culture particularly, we're probably at a pretty reliable place to start when we're looking at what we're trying to do in our work. The last comment before I get into the ELW would be a question about how art renews lives. And I mentioned briefly the idea that theology is a reflection on faith, or a way in which we understand what we believe. I think renewal happens when we are open to, again, in the bigger picture, the truth of the word proclaimed. We're open to what is good and what is beautiful. And particularly in the context of worship, there's many languages of worship. Within worship, there's the audible language, the word, right? The spoken word. There's the visual language, what we see. There's what we smell, if you have incense, or lilies at Easter, what we touch, communion. I mean, all the senses are engaged. I think renewal can happen when we receive that truth, that reality within us, and our lives can be transformed. So what I would say is that good liturgical art, or the icon in the larger kind of picture, offers us this vision, the way that the word does it in its message. And so that's the way in which I think good liturgical art, good sacred art, good Christian art, authentic, can renew us, the way that the word renews us. It's a different language. It taps into a different aspect of us, and one that maybe we're not as common to us, or we're not as familiar with, or we haven't really flexed the muscles of as much. But certainly it's there for us within the larger tradition. And I think, from my experience, some of that at least is being recovered and once again welcomed and embraced within the Lutheran traditions. So with that said, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the hymnal. This is very specific now of the ELW. And for those who have their hymnals, you can grab that and open it up. For those who don't, I will try to hold up the image at least briefly on the screen here so you have some idea of what we're referencing. A little bit about the process. ELW was created about 15 years ago. I had mentioned that from my end anyway, I don't know, I'm not privy to all of the dynamics going on with the book of worship. Well, actually, that's a good distinction I'll talk about in a little bit here. For example, I know very little about the questions or dynamics that went on regarding choosing the hymns for the new book of worship and things of that sort. I imagine that was a very extensive process in which certain hymns that maybe had been sung before were not being sung as much, and the new ones were coming in, that kind of dynamic. My focus again was on the art. If you thumb through ELW, you'll notice that there are a variety of different art in there from different artists. My work was what I would call the ritual art. There are other pages of art that I think were placed in there to give the book of worship a little more variety, maybe some contemporary focus at times, different mediums used, different vision of an artist. And those function, I think, in that capacity, kind of to embellish and to kind of fill out the book of worship. But my images were those specifically related to the different parts of the book of worship: word, communion, the various seasons of the church. And to me, that even the difference there in that art touches a little bit upon what I said earlier, which is the variety of arts in there, I think, is very good. There's maybe a few pieces of art in the book of worship that I may not have put in myself, but I think in general good. But they function differently. Some of the works that are in there celebrate a certain aspect of our lives, but may not have been worked very well for a specific area of liturgy, such as word or communion and so forth. And so again, it's an issue of kind of looking at the context of how you go about doing this. There was, again, an emphasis on frequent communion and adult baptism, but also I give the leaders of this at the time kudos, because what the ELCA was doing also was recovering a sense of the book of worship. Notice the terminology. It was not the hymnal anymore. It was the book of worship. So one of the focuses was to move in more in the direction to be certainly filled with hymns, but not only hymns. That a book of worship includes all of the rites and rituals in the life of the church. It includes imagery. It includes, there are, I think, 3 settings for communion that are in the book of worship that would not maybe have been there before. Again, the emphasis on encouraging more frequent communion within the life of the ELCA Synod. And then my focus was on the imagery, and I was asked to, I'll never forget this, I was asked to create images that were perfectly traditional and perfectly contemporary at the same time. So he said, well, no pressure there, right? So I don't know if I accomplished that. I hope that I came somewhat close, perhaps. But the idea was they're set from the beginning that there wanted to be a continuity, but there was also something very implicit within that request, that the Lutheran tradition valued tradition and valued moving ahead in time. I think most churches do, going, as pilgrims on this earth, going forth in time and building, but also valued the tradition in a very specific way. And so I think that that's something to reflect upon too, in terms of your own thinking. I think of the Lutheran tradition as kind of set right, in some ways, kind of right at the crossroads of the more traditional liturgical churches and the more evangelical focus, particularly we find in our culture today. So the inclusion of imagery, again, was really a wonderful thing because, again, I'm Catholic, and so the larger tradition of missals and things in the life of the church were filled with wonderful imagery, but then that tradition kind of went on the wayside. And so in some ways, the Synod was recovering that for the larger church, and that has been subsequently the case for other hymnals that have come about. So I was given by a team. I believe there was a team at Augsburg Fortress. I worked with Augsburg Fortress. There was a team of people in charge of doing that. I'm not sure all the specifics of how that works, but we had certainly many of the people at the publishing house, the editors and so forth involved. There were ordained ministers that were on the team. And generally speaking, they would propose to me what category the image was to be in. Like, say, was it to be an image for the word? Was it to be image for communion? Was it to be image for the vigil? Was it to be image for confession? Whatever it might be. There were larger images and smaller ones. There were those that really kind of were a more headline image that started a whole section of the book. And then there were smaller images that were used in smaller areas. And if you go through ELW, you will see that as well. And then sometimes I was given very specific ideas of what to do. Like we want an image of the assembly gathered. Again, these are ritual images. I think the only one that's not a ritual image that I created was for the Psalms. And that was a biblical image where you have a tree and you have a deer by the stream and so forth. But most of them were ritual images. And so my focus was that. So they kind of gave me a fairly good idea of what they were looking for. What I would say is they gave me kind of the nuts and bolts, if you will, the bones of it. Then it was up to me to envision that. Okay. So if this is what you want to accomplish, A, B, and C, how do you envision that? And then I will explore here a little bit with you what went on in my mind and what are some principles I use. Again, there were major images, minor images. There were also several editions and several later books. So you had the Pew edition, which is the one in the pews of the church, which are used by the assembly. The lectionary edition, which is the larger one used for various, for the readings and the gospels and so forth. They have a set of different imageries I did. And then you also had subsequent other books, like books that were published that did like certain rites within the Lutheran Church that are like done like a ordination rite or sending rite for, for certain kinds of ministries in the church. So, but what we're going to focus on today is the pew edition. There's a few things that I think about when I think of creating work like this. I'm under the belief in general that good liturgical art is always a communion of the human and the divine. So let me say that again. I think good, authentic liturgical art is always in some form, a communion of the human and the divine. So that's the ramification of the incarnation, God becoming one of us so that we may participate in divine life. And so what I would say is, in general, my experience, that work that tends to bridge that gap, that tends to be recognizable enough so it speaks to the human experience, which there's no way around, okay? Our human experience is there. There's no way around that. There's no way to escape that, if you will. But God has infused that with divine reality, and that's the good news. And so for me, good liturgical art always bridges that gap and always represents a communion of the human and divine. Another way to say that might be naturalism and abstraction. I think the naturalism in art tends to appeal to that part of ourselves that wants to be fully alive as humans. We want to root ourselves, we want to be shaped by, informed by, and be interested in the very nitty-gritty parts of the human experience. The abstract tends to be kind of the art that's often kind of created when we find that specificity is limiting, or we want to have some message or image which helps us transcend that, right? An abstract piece may be abstract enough where we feel more in touch with a reality beyond the specifics, okay? Although I make one side comment, which I think is very important, is I make a distinction between traditional abstraction and contemporary abstraction. If any of you have been in school and you've written a graduate paper or a thesis paper, you know that in the very beginning of the thesis paper, there is a little area that is a synopsis, kind of a cliff notes of the whole paper. It tells you in like 2 paragraphs what the whole paper is about. That traditionally has been called the abstract. But in the abstract, not in the sense of saying whatever you want to say or jumbling the words of the paper, but rather a very clear and distinct synopsis. You get right to the heart of the point. And that's what a traditionally abstract means. I think we live in a culture where abstract can also mean creating 2 or 3 paragraphs that don't make any sense anymore, that really are not a synopsis of the whole paper. They don't clarify things, they actually confuse things. So I would make a distinction. I think that in that sense, maybe abstract work tends to create more of a mood in a church or a setting, but it may be because of the approach, it may cease to be able to communicate very specific things about the life of the church. If you have questions about that, I'd be happy to do it. But I just, as a side note, I make that distinction because I do think that authentic ritual art in the life of the church does have an abstract dimension to it by necessity, but not necessarily contemporary abstract views. It's more of the traditional idea of coming right to the heart of the matter. Within the images that I created for ELW, notice there are several things. First, a given aspect was 3 colors. So we have black, red, and white, right? These are very traditional colors used for liturgical publications. You can go back hundreds and maybe even thousands of years, although probably more hundreds when you're thinking about color. But red is oftentimes used as the spot color, along with black and white in liturgical publications. But it also has, pardon me?
I'm going to give you the 1-minute warning.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you.
All right. I'm running a little bit behind here. So then what I'll do then, I'm going to move right to some of the imagery. So let's do this. Let's turn to page 11.
Oh,
This is the image. Okay. So one of the things I want to focus on in the work is the use of silhouette the use of dark and light, the integration of the image with the page itself, and a focus on inclusion, diversity, and an awareness of ethnicity, gender, and age. So this is kind of the signature image of it, what I call the calendar Christ. It's the 4 seasons, but the idea begins when you open the hymnal with this beautiful kind of representation of Christ being at the center of all creation. So a good example of the human and the divine merged together. If you go to page 94, this is an image of the Word, right? Oh, excuse me, no, Holy Communion. So at play here is the dynamic of the circle. The figures are represented there in a circular form, the idea of the circle always being kind of an image that evokes oneness or communion. A prominence of the Paschal candle, so the connection with communion and the resurrection. The figures can be perceived as most any ethnicity, most any gender. I was aware of trying to create smaller and larger images to represent age. And in general speaking, they're clothed in their baptismal garments. So rather than wearing a dress or pants or something of that sort, they're imaged in a liturgical vestment or a liturgical garment, which again would be important for the liturgy itself. If you go to page 210, I might run over just a minute here, but I should be wrapping up here soon for this part. This is a service of the Word. Again, the same kind of dynamics at play. One interesting thing here with this image I recall was when I first proposed this image, I had the pastor at the very top of the image. There was no particular reason I thought I did it, just it was compositional. But the response I got was they wanted the pastor represented in the middle of the people. So I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of conversation back and forth about how the Lutheran assembly might understand the role of the pastor versus how someone may envision it from another tradition. Unique here is someone in a wheelchair, but even in the wheelchair, I wanted to recognize the importance of the variety of people in our assemblies. But even here, the wheel of the chair is a cross. So there's a sense here that even within a person's disability or handicap, the grace of Christ is present and somehow transforming our lives, even in our limitations. And then the Word here, very important in the Lutheran tradition, is very large and kind of central in a way, although the bottom of the page somewhat central to the events. 227, this is Holy Baptism. And even the word itself, holy baptism, rather than just saying baptism or just saying communion, by saying holy baptism or holy communion, you are revealing that you're trying to depict something that's beyond just the purely natural here. And so a couple things at play within this image was a focus on adult baptism. You notice within the image that the person is baptized into the death of Christ, imaged by the cross behind the person, washed by the blood of Christ, which is imaged in the pool in the red. Again, the Paschal candle is there because the team of people wanted the association of baptism with Eucharist and also with resurrection. And the last image I will talk about is on page 266. And this is the Vigil image. So the Easter Vigil was also an emphasis of restoration within the hymnal project to actually have rites for the Vigil. Notice here that you have the baptismal bowl or washing of the feet or baptism related to this event as well. So everything is being linked back to the Paschal candle or to our baptism. And then the cross of Christ is budding. So at the Vigil, is the beginnings of the life of the beginnings of the life that comes forth from the cross, from the crucifixion of Jesus, the life-giving cross. Again, a very unified composition, making use of what I would call sacred geometry, which is the understructure within an image of sacred geometry, circles, squares, pyramids, and so forth, that reveal a certain sacred connection between the various components within the art being created. So, aware of the time, I will end there and be happy to answer any questions people may have about what I've said, clarifications or questions that came to you, or anything else that may help you in your discernment of moving ahead with imagery for your church.
Thank you, Nicholas. We're going to need in now, and if you have questions, write them out. We will take at the beginning of next week. So if your questions, we don't have time to deal with them now, but if you have them, make sure you write them out, and we will start next week by looking. So thank you, Nicholas, and thank you all, both here and online.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
What did they close it now?
Mhm.
It's very